Hi, today I will be talking about the history of special education in the United States. I was really drawn by this subject because of the experience I've had with children with disabilities. It was not uncommon to see a child with a disability in Alma Public Schools. Students would see them as student managers for sports or even just attending the school events. Children with disabilities would be sitting next to us in class and then walk down to their separate classroom for the part of the day. Growing up around this environment has made me imagine those who weren't so lucky to have the education for special needs like we do now. I will walk through the history of special education, starting from before the 1900s all the way to present time. Special education was neglected from the start of education in the United States. Children with disabilities were often looked down on and unworthy of education. According to a journal written by William Mayhill, before the 20th century, children with disabilities were commonly viewed as dumb, crippled, feeble minded, mentally defective, or deceased under a medical model of disability. In the colonial times, like other students, many children were taught at home by their parents. However, when public schools were becoming a more ideal approach for schooling, children with disabilities were not welcome. Until the 1800s, children with disabilities either didn't get an education or were taught at home. It wasn't until 1817 when the special education became something more. The American School for the Deaf opened its doors wide in 1817 at Hartfield, Connecticut. Here is an awesome picture of that school at that time. However, I did check the website out and it looks like they're doing some really cool renovations and it's a lot bigger than this. And it's really awesome to look at. Lots of history in that. For example, soon more schools specific for disability cropped up. For example, Perkins Institution for the Blind opened in 1832 at Boston, Massachusetts. Students were expected to live and learn there like a boarding school. Throughout the 1800s, schools specializing in a disability continued to grow. Unfortunately, court cases still made it okay to exclude children with disabilities from public schools. Watson versus City of Cambridge in 1893 is one of the most remembered cases. Fort Law Group states that the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled a child who was weak of mind and could not benefit from the instruction was troublesome to other children, made unusual noises, and was unable to take ordinary, decent physical care of himself, could be expelled from public school. As time leads us to the 20th century, we see a lot of change in special education. Starting in the early 1900s and leading up to the 1920s, public schools in bigger cities such as Boston were creating separate classes in public schools for children with disabilities. Bigger cities such as Chicago, Philadelphia, Cleveland, New York, and among others, had taken similar approaches to help students with disabilities. This way of teaching became standard by the 1920s in most large school systems and some smaller cities. Schools in small town or rural settings had the opposite approach due to the local control of funding, hiring, teacher training, and curriculum development. They offered limited hours of school and often had just one teacher. Despite efforts to include these children in public schools, there were still a number of states that still wanted them to be excluded. In a journal written by Yale and Rogers, another important case is discussed. They stated in 1934, the Cuyahoga County Court of Appeals in Ohio ruled that the state statute mandating compulsory attendance for children aged 6 through 18 years gave the Department of Education the authority to exclude certain students. States continued to enact statutes till 1969 that authorized school officials to exclude students with disabilities. During this time period, the civil rights movement was also helping America realize that segregation based on disability was also unconstitutional. Finally, court cases were being made that were in favor for those with disabilities. A great example is the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens versus Pennsylvania in 1972. This case outcome was of a consent agreement that children with mental retardation between ages 6 to 21 years must be provided a free public education. Soon after this case, 46 right to education cases were filed on behalf of children with disabilities in 28 states. Despite new efforts, many wondered why schools were not giving in. Schools did not have sufficient funds. The facilities were inadequate, and there wasn't available trained teachers. Most states had passed laws to include children with disabilities into their school. However, they still needed push from the federal level. The first federal support was the rehabilitation. Special education now can commonly be seen with children who are sitting side by side with their classmates in the same room. Like my school, they still had a separate place where they could go to learn certain subjects. However, it is often seen that some schools don't even have separate classrooms anymore. The statistics are skyrocketing for special needs who have been graduating from high schools and going on. And the programs are getting better, and I believe the training is also thriving. And here is my citations for this project. Thank you. Act and Amendments of 1973/1974. This act acknowledged the right of students with disabilities to an education and also provided funds for programs, specified due process procedures, and pushed for a least restrictive environment. Unfortunately, very few teachers were being trained to work with children with disabilities, and small amounts of funds were actually being given. Next, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 was pushed. The act provided federal funding to states to assist them in educating children with disabilities. It mandated that qualified students with disabilities had the right to be educated in a least restrictive environment, procedural due processes, including parent involvement, a free education and appropriate education, non-discriminatory testing, evaluation, and placement procedures. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1990 and amendments of 1997 placed more guidance for schools and teachers on the well-being of children with disabilities. It created better training guidelines and plans for children.